here is Professor Erasum to introduce our guest tonight.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I should say right at the beginning that because of the change in the date and the time of this particular talk, my daughter is getting an award at the high school in 20 minutes. So I won't be here for the talk, but I'm here for the introduction. That's never happened to me before. On the other hand, it means that I'll keep the introduction relatively short. Merriam-Webster defines the term audacious alternatively as intrepidly daring, recklessly bold, contemptuous of law, religion, or decorum, or marked by originality and verve. Academics are rarely viewed as audacious. But I believe the term fits Professor Bjorn Lomborg quite well. For example, recklessly bold seems to fit a political scientist who thinks economists have something useful to say. I want to focus on what I view as the intrepidly daring and original part of his work. Just 7 years after completing his doctorate, Professor Lomborg founded the Copenhagen Consensus, which sought to establish a set of priorities for advancing global welfare by applying a cost-benefit approach to development policies. He managed to get a group of prominent economists to lay out the costs and benefits of the most promising strategies to solve the world's problems, from malnutrition to malaria, from AIDS to education, from sanitation to stability. He then convinced a second, even more prominent group of economists, including 4 Nobel laureates, to review all these proposals in order to pick a consensus strategy for world development. The book that reports on this process acknowledges, among others, the Prime Minister of Denmark. Remember, he got all these famous people to work for him 7 years out of his PhD as an associate professor. That does not happen here. The original consensus strategy was to focus on AIDS and malaria. While many thought the outcome reasonable, critics contended that the process of imposing a budget constraint to force the setting of development priorities was unnecessary. I characterize one common response as, we would have enough money to solve all the problems of the world if only the United States would stop funding its military. The second is that it is immoral to trade off one problem for another, even if we do not have enough money to solve all of the problems. To my mind, however, the most interesting response has been that of privately funded philanthropic organizations such as the Bill Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation, which are focusing their efforts on combating AIDS and malaria, rather than trying to solve all the world's problems. When you're spending your own money, it seems that resources are indeed finite and that focusing on the highest return may not be an inappropriate strategy. Professor Lomborg's intrepidly daring work on the Copenhagen Consensus has caught the attention of the development community. He was invited to demonstrate the process before the United Nations and has undertaken a similar process focusing on the development issues facing Latin America. He has been honored as a global leader for tomorrow by the World Economic Forum, named one of 50 stars of Europe by Business Week magazine, and one of 50 people who could save the planet by the Guardian newspaper. He is not, however, without his detractors, and that brings us to the alternative definition of audacious, contemptuous of law, religion, or decorum. Although maybe a bit strong, I think that could describe the book The Skeptical Environmentalist, in which Professor Lomborg, though not a scientist, complained that the evidence compiled by environmental scientists on overpopulation, deforestation, energy, and global warming lacked scientific rigor. From the responses to the book, it is clear that many members of the scientific community believe that as a non-scientist, Professor Lomborg should not be commenting on science. For example, Harvard ecologist E.O. Wilson comments on his webpage that, and I quote, "Contrarians like Lomborg are the parasite load on scholars who earn success through the slow process of peer review and approval." The magazine Scientific American devoted an amazing 10 pages aimed at rebutting the skeptical environmentalist under the heading, Science Defends Itself Against the Skeptical Environmentalist. A tenet of the scientific method is scientific skepticism, a practice by which we question the veracity of claims lacking empirical evidence. The term is most commonly employed by scientists examining claims and theories which appear to be outside mainstream science. Professor Lomborg's book turns the tables, an attempt to apply scientific skepticism to mainstream science. Professor Lomborg issued a rebuttal to the Scientific American Review, which can be found on the Scientific American website, along with editor John Rennie's rejoinder to the rebuttal. I am not an expert on the topic, and I cannot comment on the relative merits of the arguments advanced by Professor Lomborg or his critics. I am, however, an economist. And in economics, price reveals value. I note editor Rennie's 15 pages of rejoinder to Professor Lomborg's response are offered on the Scientific American website free of charge. However, to access Professor Lomborg's response, Scientific American will charge you $7.95. On behalf of the Iowa State Committee on Lectures and the World Affairs Series Committee, I am pleased to introduce Professor Bjorn Lomborg to speak on the Skeptical Environmentalist's Guide to Global Warming. Professor Lomborg.
Big pleasure to be here, and it's a great honor to have an opportunity to talk about just one thing. You mentioned a lot of different things. I will briefly mention on some of these issues, but I am going to talk primarily on global warming, and I'm also sure that's one of the most important issues probably for you to come here tonight. And I'm also very happy, I don't know if you picked up, there's flyers outside on some of the ways that we can deal with climate change, and I think that just shows we really need to have a conversation about how do we think about global warming, how do we act on global warming. So I'd like to talk about my new book called Cool It, and think about how do we actually tackle global warming, how do we also think about doing good for the world in general. My points have really been over the last 10 years, and the issue on environment in general has been twofold. It's been to say we need to get a sense of proportion. Very often we're being told that the world is falling apart, that everything is going to hell, and we got to act now and right now. Now, if this is true, of course, we should be told, but if it's not, it's unlikely to make for good policy judgment, because at the end of the day, we have to make tough choices. And that's the second point here, that there are many problems and not enough money. So we really have to make choices. We really have to ask ourselves, where do we want to start? What do we want to do first? And my sort of metaphor is that it's very unhelpful, in a sense, just to get scared if reality is a very different thing. Imagine if somebody comes up to you and put a gun to your head and say, give me all your money. It's unlikely that you're going to be thinking about alternative uses of your money. Right? It's not, oh, would I rather buy a toaster? You just hand over the money. And that's the point here, that maybe we should stop having a gun to our heads and start having a sensible conversation instead about how do we best deal with all the problems of the world. So that's really the point that I want to get to here today, and talk about how do we deal with the world's big problems. Before I go there, before I start talking about global warming, because it's such a contentious issue, let me just show you an entirely different issue, which I'm sure also has quite a bit of resonance here in Iowa. The argument on admittedly, the origins of modern environmentalism, namely the concern about pesticides, the concern about chemical influence, especially on cancer. It was the foundation of the regulatory regime for the EPA in 1970, and it's been so for most of the world. And I'd like to give you a sense of how we're very, very often not being presented with balanced evidence, and therefore very easily end up worrying in the wrong direction, having a gun to our heads, and eventually ending up making pretty bad judgments. Take a look at pesticides. It started the modern environmental movement started with Rachel Carson in 1962, worrying about a silent spring, the fact that we were going to put out all these pesticides, essentially killing off all our songbirds, causing a silent spring, but perhaps more importantly, that they were also killing our kids. She saw an alarming increase in the rate, for instance, of leukemia. And yes, It's absolutely true. Pesticides are not only dangerous for the insects they're supposed to kill off, but also for humans. We estimate that well-regulated use of pesticides in the US probably causes about 20 deaths every year. Now, the intuition would then be to say, 20 cancer deaths per year. I don't like that. Let's get rid of that. Let's stop doing that. And that's a very natural inclination. There's 20 cancer deaths out there. Don't we want to stop that? And in principle, yes, we do. But, and this is where I get, I'm the annoying guy who says, yes, but you can't just say, I'd like this. I'd love to be able to avoid 20 cancer deaths a year, but you have to say, what's the consequence of trying to do that? Of course, we could avoid 20 cancer deaths by going ecological. A lot of people are seeming to say, that's the trend, that's the way to go right now. If you go ecological, of course, you'll eventually avoid 20 cancer deaths in the US. But it will also have some other costs. We need to point that out. Yes, it would avoid these 20 deaths, but it would also have a cost of probably at least $100 billion a year, simply because ecological farming is less efficient in producing than standard farming. Now, you might say that's a little unnecessary to try to compare lifestyle. After all, are invaluable in a sense. So clearly, we should perhaps be willing to spend $100 billion. We should also realize that it means we'll have to plow up more nature simply because ecological farming is less efficient. And if we want to produce the same amount, we'll have to plow up more nature to have more farmland somewhere. Maybe not in the U.S., but somewhere we'll definitely have to do so. But still, we might also say, well, we want to do that. But of course, we also need to realize one of the best ways to avoid getting cancer is eating a lot of fruits and vegetables. The World Cancer Research Foundation studies, the biggest studies in the world, show that we could probably avoid about half of all cancers if we ate a lot more fruits and vegetables. Now, of course, people's intake of fruits and vegetables are dependent on how expensive fruits and vegetables are. And fruits and vegetables are some of the ones that are going to go up the most in price if we impose ecological farming. They'll still, of course, be bought, but people will slightly, on the margin, shift away. We estimate that with an increase of 10 to 20% in the cost of fruits and vegetables, people's consumption will go down somewhere between 5 and 10%. Now, that's important because by the World Cancer Research Foundation studies estimates, that would mean we were going to see another 26,000 cancer deaths a year in the US. And my point is simply to say, telling us that there's 20 cancer deaths, and that's absolutely true, but then saying we got to get rid of those, we should go ecological, but forgetting to tell us that that's going to cost $100 billion, mean that we'll have to plow up more nature, and that we will, in the end up with 26,000 more dead, is not good policy advice. We need to hear both sides of that argument. And I would argue, when you hear both sides, maybe we wouldn't be so focused on saying going ecological is the only right answer. Now, again, my point is simply to say we need to hear both sides before we make our decision. What we decide is obviously up to us, but we need to know. And that's in the spirit that I'd like to engage you in 45 minutes of talking about, so what should we do about global warming? This, of course, is a discussion that's become incredibly interlinked with Al Gore. Pretty much everyone talks about Al Gore. He's become very, very central. This is obviously the discussion that Al Gore has put very center in the stage. Al Gore and I gave a presentation to Congress last year. I'm sure this is the second before he realizes who I am because he's still smiling. But the point, of course, is that this is really a discussion that everybody, both the people out there who were handing you out flyers, that most of you in here, and certainly most people in the developed world, want to talk about. How should we deal with global warming? Now, this is a huge discussion. In many ways, it's a very, very complicated discussion, interlinking a lot of different sciences, and also, I would argue, social sciences. And it the UN puts out 3 800-page books every 5 or 6 years. It's a lot, and those are just the reviews of all the thousands and thousands of peer-reviewed, published journal studies. So this is a huge literature. I am going to try to say, I think you can reasonably do so, to try to reduce this discussion to just 4 fairly simple points. Of course, this is not going to do credit to all of what we talk about, but it is important that we have a sense of proportion, that we have a sense of what is the most important parts of this discussion if we're really going to have a conversation on a national level in a democratic fashion, and of course also in an international fashion. Of course, global warming is not something that we can just discuss in the US or in Europe or any other place. We really need to have this conversation globally. So I'm going to make 4 fairly simple points and try to take you through them and see where I believe those 4 points will lead us. The first point is global warming is real and it's man-made. I think it's entirely uncontroversial that we are seeing global warming happening and that it is caused by man, mainly because we burn fossil fuels, put them into the atmosphere, put CO2 into the atmosphere, and that will heat up the planet. It's on the agenda, and I think we should actually say thank you to Al Gore for that. He's put it fairly squarely on the agenda, especially convincing a lot of, perhaps especially the right wing in the US, that no, global warming isn't just a left-wing conspiracy to raise taxes, it's actually real. And we should acknowledge that. I would argue our best information comes from the UN Climate Panel, the so-called IPCC. The likely temperature rise by 2100 is 2.6 degrees centigrade, or about 5 degrees Fahrenheit, in a range of somewhere between 1.8 and 4.0 degrees centigrade. That is not a trivial amount of temperature rise. This will have definite and mostly negative impacts on the world. The total cost of global warming is estimated throughout the entire entire future at about $15 trillion. That's not a small amount of money. That certainly ought to make most of us sit up straight in our chairs and think, all right, so how are we actually going to fix this? Of course, we also need to keep a sense of proportion. $15 trillion is a lot of money, but let's just remember the net worth of the 21st century is about $3,000 trillion. So we're talking about a half a percentage point of the 21st century. And that underscores a point that I'll get back to many times. Global warming is a problem, but it's not the end of mankind. It's a problem, but it's not a catastrophe. It's a problem that we need to fix, among with many other problems, but we also need to fix it smartly. And I think that will be the consequence of all of what we're talking about here, that we have to start thinking about much better, how do we actually do this? So yes, global warming is real. Let's get our information mainly from the UN Climate Panel, but let's also keep a sense of perspective. This is a problem. It's not the end of mankind, and we need smart strategies. That's my first point. The second point, I'm sorry, they're not all going to be equally fast because then we would be done very quickly. The second point is, however, that we are often scared witless in the way that global warming is represented in the media and that we hear about it. It's often very one-sided, very exaggerated, and I would argue it leads to bad policy judgment. And that is where we need to sort of step back and start having a more sensible conversation about what we should do. So yes, global warming is real, but it's often vastly exaggerated and one-sided. And here, unfortunately, we also have to say not quite as much thanks to Al Gore. Again, this is not going to be a bashing of Al Gore because a lot of people are saying the exact same thing. Al Gore is just the most visible person saying this. And clearly, Al Gore has done everything he can to tell us this really is the most monumental crisis we're facing. He talks about this as a planetary emergency. This is a quote from his website where he says, "We have just 10 years to avert a major catastrophe that could send our entire planet into a tailspin of epic destruction involving extreme weather, floods, droughts, epidemics, and killer heat waves beyond anything we have ever experienced." That certainly sounds very, very dramatic. And I would argue again, not just Al Gore, you hear this several times a week. We hear this almost regularly. I would like to take you through some of these points because I think they're seriously misleading. Actually, and when you get back to this, this is technically true. But I'm going to show you why I believe, at least, it's dramatically misleading. And let me just take 4 of these issues. I'm sure we can have more of these conversations in the questions afterwards. And of course, I also go through more of these in my book. So let's just take a look at heat deaths, sea level rise, hurricanes, and malaria. Those are 4 good examples, both of first world and third world concerns, and some of the main points that Al Gore points out in this planetary emergency. First, let's take a look at heat deaths. As temperatures rise, are we going to see more heat deaths? Absolutely. As temperatures rise, we're going to see more heat waves. We're therefore also going to see more people dying from heat wave. Absolutely. In the UK, for instance, we have the best data because there's a huge multinational study in most of Europe that looked at this, so this is where we have the best data from. For the UK, for instance, it's estimated that by 2050, due to global warming, we're going to see about 2,000 more people die every year. Notice in August 2003, there was the biggest heat wave in Europe. It cost about 15,000 dead in France. That very, very visible heat wave cost 2,000 deaths, extra deaths in the UK. So by 2050, we estimate on average every year, we're going to see just as many die as we saw in that one year, that very, very remarkable year in 2003 in August. So this is not a trivial number. This is definitely something we ought to point out. 2,000 people are going to die every year due to global warming. That's true. But I'm simply pointing out, isn't it curious that we only hear about that side? Of course, as temperatures rise, we're going to see more heat waves. But as temperatures rise, we're also going to see fewer cold waves, and therefore, of course, fewer cold deaths. Now, of course, if there's a trivial number of people, maybe it wouldn't matter, but it's not. Actually, it's estimated by the same numbers that we see here, that by 2050 in the UK, we're likely to see about 20,000 fewer cold deaths. Now, my point here is simply to say, it's not a reasonable way to inform us to tell us there's going to be 2,000 more people dying, but forgetting to say that there's going to be 20,000 fewer people dying. Again, the point here is we need to hear the whole story. Now, again, you might say, well, this is the UK, you're in Iowa, it's also a pretty cold place. Certainly I come from Denmark. That's probably an okay place for it to get warmer. But surely that's not true for most places in the world. Well, actually, the only global peer-reviewed published estimate that we have for deaths all around the world seems to indicate otherwise. It doesn't mean this is the truth, but it does certainly indicate that actually we're expecting to see a situation where about about 400,000 extra heat deaths, but about 1.8 million fewer cold deaths. It actually holds true for all regions except for sub-Saharan Africa, where there's going to be 250,000 heat deaths, but only 200,000 avoided cold deaths. So the point here is, this is a very big and important point. We need to say both sides, and actually there's a good chance that it's so that at least when we're talking about heat and cold deaths avoided cold deaths outweigh extra heat deaths. So in essence, on this particular area, global warming is a positive. Now, obviously, if this was the only issue with global warming, this would actually seem to indicate that we should have more of it. That's not what I'm saying, because global warming will have a lot of impacts, most of them negative. That's why it's a problem. But we have to be honest and both tell the positives and the negatives. Just telling a story where we say it's all negative, that global warming is only bad for good things and only good for bad things, is a fairy tale. That's not how the real world works. We need to be able to tell the truth. So again, the point here is to say we need to understand that there's both positives and negatives. But perhaps more importantly, it's also curious that people will generally talk about these issues and say, so the solution is cutting carbon emissions. Well, that's certainly one solution, but we've got to ask, is that the best solution? Is that the best solution to help those people who died in Paris, France, because of a heat wave, to help them say, we're going to avoid future deaths by, for instance, invoking the Kyoto Protocol, cutting carbon emissions a little bit so that, yes, it'll get warmer and warmer, but slightly less so by the end of the century. Well, take a look. This is Philadelphia. We have this for all U.S. cities. This is the heat death temperature in the 1960s. This is the Fahrenheit we have out here in the afternoon, and this is the number of deaths in Philadelphia. And you have this U-curve that's very, very typical for virtually all places around the world. It really just depends on where it bottoms out. As you can see, around 80, 90 degrees Fahrenheit is the best temperature for in Philadelphia. The fewest people die there. If it gets warmer, a lot more people die. If it gets colder, a lot more people die too. Now, notice this is the 60s and 70s, 80s, 90s. Of course, we've gotten much better just simply at saving people because we have much better medical technology. But notice another thing. Heat deaths have gone away, whereas that's not true for cold deaths. Why? Because of air conditioning. Basically, people don't die in the US anymore from heat because we have air conditioning. This is not true for Europe, by the way. So the idea here is to say, if you actually want to help people, if you say, I care about those old ladies in Paris, France, and I want to make sure that this doesn't happen again, isn't it curious that we tend to focus on perhaps the place where we can do the least good the furthest out in the future, when, indeed, if we really cared about them, maybe we should give them air conditioning. Now, of course, there are other ways that we could also make cities cooler, because we know one of the things that happen to cities is that they're dramatically warmer than the surrounding countrysides. Notice LA, London, New York, they're dramatically high. They're about 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the surrounding countrysides. Tokyo is actually almost 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than its surrounding countrysides. Why? Because there's a lot of black surfaces, tarmac, and lack of water and greenery. So in London, we know that we could decrease high temperatures, that is, heat wave temperatures, some 14 degrees Fahrenheit, if we put in more water and greenery. We know that if we put in, and this sounds almost comical, but if we, for instance, put in much more white surfaces, painted much of the tarmac white, or at least in light colors, had the rooftops in white colors, we could decrease maximum temperatures in London by about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, much, much more than what we're talking about with global warming, and much cheaper, and if we put in greenery and water features, of course, much nicer too. And so my point here is simply to start having you think about, if what we actually want to do is help people that are going to be having a problem with extra heat wave temperatures, isn't it curious that we focus on turning the big wheel of CO2, which essentially will mean, it'll get warmer and warmer, but slightly less warmer and warmer by the end of the century, instead of making sure it gets much, much cooler when we want that, by including much cheaper features that'll do much more good. Again, there's something fundamentally wrong about the conversation I think we're having about global warming when any question you can ask only has one right answer: cut carbon emissions. No matter what you ask, the answer has to be cut carbon emissions. That surely can't be right. Sometimes it's undoubtedly the right answer, but surely it's not always the right answer. And clearly, if we actually want to help people with heat level problems, we can do much, much better by putting in more greenery, more water features, more light surfaces, and more air conditioning, and it's going to be much, much cheaper. So again, the idea here is to say, do we want to do a lot of good, or do we just want to talk and feel good? Let me just tell, but again, sorry, just to summarize, Al Gore tells us there's going to be more heat deaths. That's absolutely true, but it seems to me not telling us that there's going to be even more people not dying from coal is a big omission, and telling us that cutting carbon emissions is the best way to help the people who are going to be hit by heat waves seems also a bit far-fetched, because we know that there are many other much better ways to help these people. Let's just take a look at sea level rise. Sure, sea levels are going to rise as temperatures increase, mainly because water, just like everything else, expands as it gets hotter. But it is not the Al Gore 20 feet of sea level rise, as he shows in his movie, where he shows how Florida and San Francisco and New York and many other places disappear. It's about 1 foot. The UN estimates somewhere between 1/2 and 2 feet of sea level rise. Again, the standard scenario, the A1B scenario, estimate about 30 centimeters, or about 1 foot of sea level rise. 1 foot is a problem, but again, it's not the catastrophe of 20 feet. And we've got to ask ourselves, don't we want to have the right information? And again, how big of a problem is 1 foot? Well, we know, because over the last century and a half, sea levels rose about 1 foot. Yet did anyone notice? Imagine asking a very old person who've lived through most of the 20th century, likely to be a woman, and ask her, what were the important things that happened in the 20th century? She'll talk about the world wars, the suffrage for women, maybe the IT revolution, but she will not say, and sea levels rose, right? Because it was a problem we fixed. It's a problem that turns out to be surprisingly cheap to deal with. Again, it doesn't mean we wouldn't like to avoid it, but it means it's not the end of the world. And so again, we've got to come to terms with saying, how much of an impact will this actually have? Well, right now, about 10 million people get flooded every year in the world. The UN tells us that by the end of the century, about 100 million people will get flooded, both because of increasing population levels, but especially because of rising sea levels. But just remember, and they're very explicit about this, this assumes that no one changes. This assumes, and there's scientific reasons for why you make these kinds of models, but I would say they're incredibly poor predictors, because it's essentially saying people are standing around in 2020 and seeing the water lap up over their feet, and they're saying, this is not going to be bad, this is not going to be good, and then they stand around for another 80 years and drown. Yeah. That's not how people really work, right? The point, of course, is if you assume not only that people will adapt, but also that as we get richer, and all models estimate that the average person, even in the developing world, would be much richer by the end of the century. If we just assume that we spend the same proportion of our income on this bigger and bigger problem, the models show a very different picture, namely only 1 million people will be flooded by the end of the century, which of course sends a very, very different message. And I would argue this is the much more likely outcome. And of course, the last 1 million people, this is not a climate problem, this is a poverty problem. So again, if we care about the people who are going to get flooded, shouldn't we do something for them rather than try to slightly lower the increase in sea level rise? Actually, we can take this a little bit further, and let me just do that. Take a look at the Maldives. The Maldives, in many ways, is the perfect sort of metaphor for global warming. If we just look at the Maldives and the height curves of the Maldives and say, what will happen if we see a 1-foot sea level rise? The answer is 77% of the Maldives are going to be gone by the end of the century. The cost to the Maldives is going to be about 121% discounted back to till today of their GDP. That's obviously a huge impact in both physical dimensions and in economic dimensions. But what we're usually not being told is that it's incredibly cost efficient to do something about it. Our models show that for about 0.04% of their GDP, they can basically safeguard all their dry land, which of course is why they have also survived the last 150 years, and they're likely to spend 0.04% of their GDP to avoid a cost of 121% of their GDP, just like all other countries already done over the last 150 years. Actually, there's an even further point in this, because the question is, many of us want to cut carbon emissions to help the Maldives and to help other countries. By the way, the Maldives is a nice place, it's a beautiful icon, but this actually also holds true for the other iconic places like Tuvalu and Micronesia, but perhaps much more importantly, it also holds true for Bangladesh and Vietnam. Both of these countries can, for much less than 0.1% of their GDP, avoid virtually all loss of dry land. But let me just go further and say, let's try and take a look at what can we do. The UN Climate Panel has two main scenarios. It has an A scenario and a B scenario. The A scenario worries mainly about economics. The B scenario worries much more about environment. The B scenario, not surprisingly, we're slightly less richer by the end of the century, but we also have less environmental problems. Now, the question is, where would the Maldives be better off? Now, the intuition, at least, would be to say, sure, they might be less well off in the B scenario, but at least they'll have less sea level rise to contend with. So at least on that factor, they should be better off. But that would be wrong to argue, because we forget that wealth is also an important way to deal with this problem. So yes, in a situation where you have lower sea level rise but less wealth, as expected by the UN Climate Panel's B scenario, we actually see that the Maldives are going to lose 3 times more dry land. Now notice, of course, we're talking about very little loss of dry land no matter what, simply because it's so cheap. But it gives you an indication that very often, in order to try to do good, we can very easily end up doing less good than we could otherwise have done. We'll actually end up making both less wealthy, which of course will have many other impacts, and also less able to deal with the lower sea level rise that they're going to see. Yes, they're not going to see as much sea level rise, but they will have less ability to deal with it, and so they'll actually end up losing more dry land. So my point here is, again, we need to have a conversation where not the only variable is cutting carbon emissions. Presumably what we care about is not the contents of CO2 in the atmosphere or even the temperature. What we care about is the impact on the planet, on people, and the environment. And we got to ask ourselves, are there better, more efficient ways that we can actually help people and the environment, or is cutting carbon emissions indeed the best strategy? And again here, when we look at sea level rise, it doesn't seem to be the case. So when Al Gore comes out and tells us sea levels are going to rise, that's absolutely true, but it's not going to be the 20 feet that Al Gore tells us about. And also, again, it's pointing in the wrong direction if we really try to help the Maldives by making them, yes, poorer, but they will also have less sea level rise, because at the end of the day, it actually means, apart from all the other negative impacts, they will also lose more dry land. So again, my point is to say Al Gore's technically right, but it's dramatically misleading telling us that sea level rise really tells us so we should cut carbon emissions dramatically right now. Well, no, maybe we should make sure that countries like the Maldives and Vietnam and Bangladesh and the others will be much better able to deal with those issues come the end of the century. Let me just show you one more thing, the hurricanes. I heard you're going to see Emmanuel Carey in a couple of weeks. He's one of the great participants in this whole discussion, and it will also be interesting to see his view on these issues. But he's been very, very vocal in pointing out that what I'm about to tell you is certainly the vast part of this discussion. It doesn't mean that it's the whole part, and I think he and I would probably disagree on some of the issues, but the main point here is definitely true. A lot of people, including Al Gore, will tell you as global warming wears on, we're going to see more and ever more damage from hurricanes. This is the hurricane damage from the U.S., and that certainly seems to indicate that Al Gore's right. Basically, from 1900 up till 2005, what you've seen, do you remember Hurricane Andrew in 1992? That used to be the biggest and most damaging hurricane in the U.S. That was ousted by the 2004 hurricane season, which, of course, again, was bested by the hurricane season of 2005, including Hurricane Katrina. What this seems to indicate is that we're going to see an ever-increasing damage curve from hurricanes in the U.S., and that's absolutely true. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. But it has very little to do with global warming. This is predominantly due to the fact that many more people live much closer to the coastline with much more stuff. I mean, take a look at it. The U.S. population of the last century quadrupled, but the Florida coastal population increased in the same time 50-fold. So it's not very, I mean, it's a beautiful place to live when there's not a hurricane, right? So it's not very surprising that a lot of people want to live there. But of course, when many, many more people live there with much more and much more expensive stuff, it's not very surprising that we're going to see dramatically increasing costs. So the real point here is to say, what would this have looked like if we could correct for that social factor? That was actually what some of the researchers who compiled these numbers said. What would have happened if all U.S. hurricanes over the last 105 years had hit the U.S. as it looks today? This is the damage curve they came up with. Notice the very, very dramatic difference of what we suddenly see here. This is the damage curve. Actually, the most damaging hurricane in the U.S. history would have been the great Miami hurricane of 1926, which tore right through downtown Miami, killed more people than were killed in Hurricane Katrina, even though there were many, many fewer people around back then. But there just wasn't very much to damage, right? I mean, it was all sheds, and that's not entirely true, but you get the point, right? The idea is to say there was not much to damage. But had it been Miami today, this is the kind of impact that it would have had. Actually, the second costliest hurricane in the U.S. history would have been the Great Galveston hurricane in 1900, which is also the deadliest hurricane in the U.S. history, killed about 15,000 people. But again, there was no damage there because there was no stuff to damage back then. But again, the point here is to say we have to hear the whole story, not just say, oh, we're going to see dramatically increasing cost. That's true. That's due to global warming, so we should do something about it. Now, notice there is probably an issue of that global warming will cause worse hurricanes. That's what I'm sure Emmanuel is going to talk about in a couple of weeks. It's still a big discussion, and it's actually, I would argue, not settled. But it's probably likely, and most believe, that we're going to see somewhat more ferocious hurricanes, though probably not more hurricanes, but probably more ferocious hurricanes. But it's a marginal part of what is going to happen to the increase for the U.S. damages. Actually, let's try and take a look at what is the components of what will happen up till 2050. And if we take reasonable worst-case scenarios for the impact of global warming, this is what we see. That till 2050, if there was no social change but only climate change, we would see a 10% increase in the damages from hurricanes in the U.S. till 2050. If there was no climate change but the social factors change as we expect them to do till 2050, we're likely to see about 500% increase in the damages in the U.S. The point here again is simply to say, where should we start focusing if we want to make it better for future victims of Katrina, Charlie, Andrew, all the others? Should we start cutting this a little bit? If we do the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, if everybody did the Kyoto Protocol all the way through the century, we could probably shave about 0.5 percentage point off this curve. Now, that'd be nice. But isn't it curious we don't talk about how we could cut this? It turns out that for very easy and simple policy measures, we could probably cut somewhere between 250 and 400 percentage points on this graph. So again, my point is simply to say, if we care about future victims, shouldn't we do a lot before we do a little? Now, curiously, many of us don't even have an idea of how we'd start doing something about this. And again, of course, what I think is that it shows the conversation is simply not focused on what we can do, but only focused on one thing, namely cutting carbon emissions. Actually, this is about making sure, for instance, in Florida, that we don't subsidize insurance. I mean, we're basically encouraging people to build irresponsibly. We should also have better building codes. We should have better enforcement of building codes. We should perhaps have more wetlands in front of Louisiana, which would slow down Katrinas. And of course, we should also have better levees around New Orleans. Those are some of the very, very simple things that would have much lower cost than carbon emission cuts, and that could reasonably cut this by 250 to 400 percentage points. So again, my question is, if we proclaim that we care about future victims of Katrina and Andrew and all the others, isn't it curious that we say, so we're going to do climate change policies, which essentially mean, yeah, it's going to get ever worse, but slightly less ever worse. Instead of actually saying, we're going to do something that'll actually cost to go down, that actually going to cause fewer damages into the future. Again, the conversation ought to be about how do we do the most good. So yes, Al Gore's right in saying that there's going to be more hurricane damage, but he's wrong in mainly ascribing that to global warming. Actually, the vast increase is going to come from social factors. And so pointing in the wrong direction leads us to focus on ineffective policy choices. The last point I want to mention is malaria. Malaria and many other infectious diseases are often used as one of the terrifying impacts of global warming. And again, it's probably true that with increasing temperatures, we probably will see a little more malaria because malaria is weakly correlated to temperature. So we estimate that by the end of the century, we'll probably see about 3.2% more malaria. So that's important. But it seems to me, again, curious that we focus so much on a weak correlation with temperature when we know that malaria is strongly correlated to wealth. If you're rich, you don't get malaria. Even if you get malaria, you don't die from malaria. If you're poor, you get malaria and you die from malaria. And so the question really is, how much can we do? Well, if we're going to see 3.2% more malaria by the end of the century, we can, with reasonable assumption, for instance, the Kyoto Protocol, probably cut about 0.2% malaria at the end of the century. I'm simply asking, isn't it curious that we care so much about cutting 0.2% malaria at the end of the century, but care so fairly little for the 100% that is here right now? Presumably, people who die from malaria don't really care all that much whether they're stung by new exciting global warming mosquitoes or just die from regular old-fashioned mosquitoes. And so the idea here is again to ask, what can we actually do? Well, we do know pretty much. If we, for instance, do the Kyoto Protocol, we could probably avoid about 1,400 people dying every year throughout the century from global warming, from malaria. I certainly want to be part of a civilization that cares for 1,400 people every year throughout the century. It just strikes me as odd that if we really care about malaria victims, that we don't seem to focus on the fact that we could save 850,000 people from dying from malaria every year throughout this century. Oh, and at much, much lower cost, at about 1/60th of the cost. Or to put it differently, for every person that we can save dying from malaria through climate change policies, the same money spent on malaria-specific policies could save 35,000 people from dying. I'm simply asking, shouldn't we first save 35,000 people before we save one? Again, the point here is to say, so when Al Gore comes out and says there's going to be more heat waves, and more heat, that's not true, but he fails to tell us that there are going to be fewer cold deaths, and probably more avoided cold deaths than heat deaths. And he also fails to tell us that if we actually want to help the people with heat deaths, there are many other cheaper and much more efficient policies. And that holds true for sea level rise as well, that holds true for hurricanes as well, and that certainly also holds true for malaria. The problem is that we're being told a host of issues. We're not being told the other side of the argument, and we're not being told how can we best how can we best direct our policies so we actually end up doing a lot of good rather than just a little good. And so those are the two first points. Then I'll promise you I'll be a little faster. Yes, global warming is real, but it's often vastly exaggerated, and that's why we lead to bad policy judgments. I would argue we need much, much smarter policies. Right now, the kind of policies that we have is, for instance, the Kyoto Protocol. Now, if everybody, including the US and Australia, had signed up to the Kyoto Protocol, everybody had actually done what they'd promised in Kyoto, namely cutting their emissions, including Canada and Spain and Japan and the others that are not actually going to do it. If everybody had done this, the Kyoto Protocol would have postponed global warming by the end of the century by 7 days. That's not a whole lot. And this is entirely uncontroversial. This is what all our models show. This is if we had extended the Kyoto Protocol all the way through the 21st century and everybody had kept their promise, which would get ever harder to do. Even if we'd done that, we would only postpone global warming by the end of the century by about 5 years. This is one of the lead models from the UN Climate Panel. This is entirely uncontroversial. The average cost of all the macroeconomic models of what the Kyoto Protocol would cost is about $180 billion. My point is simply to say it's a lot of money, $180 billion every year for the rest of the century to do virtually no good even 100 years from now, to postpone a problem so slight that you wouldn't even be able to measure it by the end of the century. That, I think, is the main problem of global warming. And let me just, in interest of time, run a little ahead and just let's start talking about we need, I would argue, smarter, better policies. Before I get there, I'd like to give you a metaphor that I think in many ways encapsulates what I think both is wrong about the global warming debate, but also what we need in order to move forward and get a better global warming debate. Take polar bears. Polar bears have become the icon of global warming. And clearly everybody believes polar bears are in dire straits because of global warming and it can only get worse. Well, actually, polar bears populations have increased dramatically. They're probably quadruple over the last 50 years. But this does not mean that polar bears will not see harder times ahead as sea levels start as Arctic ice starts diminishing and eventually entirely disappear in the summer Arctic. That will cause problems for polar bears, and we'll probably see a decline in polar bear populations. But my question then is, isn't it curious that nobody seems to tell us what would be the impact that we could help these polar bears with if we, for instance, did climate policies? Well, but with reasonable estimates, if everybody did the Kyoto Protocol, including the US and Canada, and everybody lived up to it, including all these nations that are not doing it, and everybody did it all the way through the century, the net effect would be to save about 1 polar bear every year. Now, I'm all for saving a polar bear, even if it costs a couple $100 billion a year. But it seems curious to me that there is nowhere a conversation about the fact that every year we shoot somewhere between 300 and 500 polar bears. I don't know about you, but it just seems to me, this is the top estimate, the 1,000, it seems to me that maybe we should stop shooting 300 to 500 polar bears first before we engage in policies to spend hundreds of billions of dollars helping 1 polar bear. Again, the point here is if we start having a conversation about how can we do this smartest, we would obviously have run into this. But because we only focus on one answer, there's only one answer that's right, namely cut carbon emissions, we don't see that because the only answer is cut carbon emissions. We have to find a better way to have this conversation. The discussion that I think really needs to take place is the fact that the cost of cutting carbon emissions right now is pretty high. It's about $20 per ton just in the Kyoto regime or even higher. Yet the benefit by all macroeconomic models, if you look at it, the median is about $2 per ton. So for every ton you cut, you probably do about $2 worth of good for the world. That's a bad deal, spending $20 to do $2 worth of good. Most environmentalists will treat this dilemma by talking this number up. But I mean, honestly, you can't talk it up. If this is the number, then that's it. What we can do, however, is to cut this number. Because this is a technological number. Right now it costs $20. It need not always do. At the end of the day, that's the only way we're going to solve the problem. Let me give you a metaphor. Right now, solar panels cost perhaps 10 times as much as fossil fuels. That means a few rich people in the rich world will have solar panels on their rooftops, mainly, of course, to show how good people they are. But the problem is it's not going to work to fix climate change by pressuring people to put up a few more of these very inefficient solar panels on their rooftops. It's just not going to do it. The point is we need to make solar panels much cheaper. Only that way will we get a lot of people in the developed world to do this, but of course only in that way will we get China and India and everybody else on board. So imagine if we could invest dramatically more in research and development, make solar panels much more efficient. Imagine if we could make solar panels as efficient as fossil fuels by, say, 2060, or even cheaper. We would have fixed global warming. People would switch over from fossil fuel to solar panels, not because they're good people, not because they're green, not because they're concerned, but because we had made it cheaper for them to do so. So again, the point here is to say we have to start finding smart ways to deal with this problem instead of just relying on everybody sacrificing a lot and doing actually no good. And that's why I would argue in the next Kyoto Protocol that we're actually going to sign in my home city of Copenhagen late next year, I would say instead of trying to do the Kyoto Protocol again, which didn't go that well the first time around, maybe we should start finding a different strategy. I would argue, let's invest 0.05% of GDP in research, development, and demonstration of non-carbon emitting energy technologies. The point is, this would be 10 times cheaper than the Kyoto Protocol, but it would be a tenfold increase in what the world spends on research and development right now. So we'd actually be able to do 10 times better with 10 times less. That's a good proposal. That's one that has the chance of both being accepted by the developed world, but also by the developing world. It's likely that we could also get China on board because this would be a percentage of the GDP. And of course, it has the positive image of instead of saying we have to cut back, we have to feel bad about everything we do, it's a positive image of actually saying we can do stuff. And of course, it's about finding the solutions that will power the rest of the century. I don't think we know. I gave you the what's going to power the 21st century. I gave you the metaphor of solar panels, but I think we should let all countries make up their own minds on what they want to focus on. It might be renewables, it might be fission, fusion, conservation, carbon storage, or second-generation biofuels. But the point is, we don't need all of this to come true. We just need some of these to come through, and those are the technologies that will power the rest of the 21st century. So again, it's about making sure that we stop having a gun to our heads, but start thinking smartly about how we can deal with this. And actually, preliminary studies indicate that this sort of effort could solve global warming in the medium term. For the technically inclined, it could stabilize emissions at a concentration at around 550 ppm. So the point is, this is actually a solution that's both doable, that's politically feasible, that has much greater implications for efficiency, and will also actually fix global warming in the medium term. So my point is to say, if we can stop thinking in this very, very unproductive way, we can find much smarter ways to deal with climate change. So yes, global warming is real. It's often vastly exaggerated, leading to bad policy judgment, but we can get this discussion back on track and actually start having a conversation about what works very, very well is investment in research and development to make sure we have much cheaper technologies to fix global warming in the medium term. But I promised you a fourth one, and I'm just going to talk about that a little bit, and then I'll stop. Because we also need to remember that there are many other problems where we can do a lot more good. As I started out saying, presumably this is not a conversation about cutting carbon emissions per se, or even having a lower temperature per se. Presumably what we want is to have a world where people and the environment is better off. And we've got to ask ourselves, are we really on the way to doing that in the right way? Al Gore talks very much about global warming as our generational mission. I think it's entirely the right way to frame this discussion in. This is about how do you want to be remembered by your kids and grandkids. I'm simply surprised that Al Gore and so many other people want to be remembered by their kids and grandkids for spending $180 billion a year doing virtually no good 100 years from now. I'm not really sure our kids and grandkids are going to go going their granddad will, right? I mean, the point here is, of course, is that really all we can do? Just to give you a sense of proportion, the UN estimate that for about $75 billion a year, we could fix all major basic problems in the world. We could give clean drinking water, sanitation, basic health care, and education to every single human being on the planet. Add on the $25 billion I just talked about with research and development, and we're still about half of the amount that just the Kyoto Protocol would cost. The question I would like to ask you is, how do you want to be remembered by the future? For spending twice as much money doing virtually no good 100 years from now, or spending half that amount and fixing all major problems, including global warming, now? When you put it that way, it's really hard not to say, I think I'll pick number 2, right? But the point is, that's not the conversation that we're having. I would argue it is the conversation we ought to be having. And that's the kind of thing, that was also what Peter was talking about, that's the discussion I've been involved in the Copenhagen Consensus, where we've asked some of the world's top economists to look at all the main issues, all the main solutions to the world's big problems, and saying, where do you get the most bang for the buck? Essentially, where do you help the world in the future the most? Their answer was, the top priority is prevent HIV/AIDS, prevent micronutrient malnutrition, ensure free trade, and prevent malaria. They actually went as far as to tell us how much bang do you get for each dollar. So they told us, if you spend $1 on preventing HIV/AIDS, you do $40 worth of social good. If you prevent micronutrient malnutrition, you do $30 worth of good. If you ensure free trade, for every dollar you spend, probably on paying off French farmers, you do $15 worth of good. On preventing malaria, for every dollar you spend, you do $10 worth of good. But they also told us at the other end of the list was the Kyoto Protocol. Yes, it will do some good, but just not very much good. For every dollar you spend, you'll probably do about 30 cents worth of good, which is also why they called it a bad investment. The point here is to say we need to have a new conversation. Stop having this morally superior, oh, we got to do the global warming thing because that's the most important issue in the world. No, it's one of the many problems in the world. And because it's the one where we have a moral duty to our coming generations. No, I would actually assume if we have a moral obligation to future generations, it is to make sure that we did as much good as we possibly could. So yes, global warming is real. It's man-made. It's often vastly exaggerated. But that's why we need to have smarter strategies. We need essentially to realize we're not going to solve it through our standard solutions of Kyoto or that kind of thing. It's all fine to change your light bulbs or get a Prius, but that's not what's going to solve climate change. What will solve climate change is investing dramatically in research and development to have much cheaper technologies so that everyone, not just rich, well-meaning Westerners, but everyone can afford and will change their habits over the century. And then we also have to remember, if we want to leave this as a generational mission that we can be proud of, we have to make sure that we actually did the best we can, dealing with the many other problems as well. And that's why, as we don't have all the money in the world, we should make sure we spend it wisely and do the best things first. Thank you very much.
Is that on here? Can everyone hear me? All right, great. Thank you for coming out. We'll have time to ask a few questions. We'll ask that you do keep your questions concise so we can squeeze as many in as possible.
When you say that the effects of global warming have been, the significance of them have been overblown, how can you not say the significance of money is not overblown when the economy is simply a construct controlled by the elite who stand the most to gain from ignoring global warming, and throwing funding at something only makes either humans or the other millions of species more dependent on that funding and less able to fend for themselves on the environment that actually exists.